So as joyful and happy and exuberant as the B-flat Prelude is for Rachmaninoff, his B minor Prelude is very much the opposite. It's quite a dark piece. And according to a conversation he had with the pianist Beno Moiseyevich, he wrote this piece to describe his exile from his homeland of Russia. After he left Russia and lived in the United States, he was never to return to his home country. He always missed his home country and wanted to go back, and this prelude is about that feeling. Believe it or not, the most difficulty that I had with this piece is not any of the technical stuff. It's not any of the loud chords or any of this passage work, but it's just the simple phrasing at the very beginning of the piece. For a few reasons. One, it's lento, so it's very slow. It's very soft. There's not much dynamic range. And it has a repetitive rhythmic pattern, da, 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 da. And to be able to play that over the course of these several pages, and then it returns again at the end of the piece, it's not easy to do without making it sound boring. So this is the main motif that this entire piece is written around. This dotted triplet figure. And I tried going through it several different ways in the first line. So after experimenting with different phrasing, different direction, I think what I finally ended up liking is something like this. There's a natural tendency for people to start a line of music, grow, and then diminuendo, what we call an arch phrase. And it's very common, but I realized very quickly that it wasn't working in this piece. And because I wanted to get this feeling of profound sadness, I decided to try immediately diminuendoing out of all of these phrases. Then I kind of crescendo to this one, and I fall back down at the end of the phrase. In my mind, I have the image of being on the ocean on a ship with all these glaciers and icebergs, and everything's just moving very, very slowly and turning. That's the kind of pacing and the kind of speed I want to have at the beginning of this piece before it finally starts to pick up. Alfred, why is it that as soon as I start vlogging, you get all hyper? But again, the difficulty is always in playing a slow pace, not making it boring. So you have to find these little changes, like these two places with the mezzo forte, which quickly diminuendo. On the second one, sometimes I try and bring out the tenor voice rather than the soprano voice. Nothing indicates that particularly, but it just adds a little bit of variety to the texture. Finally, we have a poco più mosso section where you have this upper melody, and things begin to move faster and faster until you get to this pesante section, which leads to this crashing chord here, this fortissimo. something I find fascinating about this piece is although there are elements that are very much Rachmaninoff, like the huge chords, the dense chords, and the harmonies, as far as melody is speaking, it is one of maybe his... It's not very melodic. There are interesting details, though, which when learning quickly someone might glance over. For instance, he chooses to start the crescendo in a place you might not expect. So coming out of this musical line, you might want to do this. Close out that phrase. That would be the logical thing to do. However, he asks for a crescendo. So little things like this do matter, especially when he specifically writes it in, because I don't think many people would intuitively crescendo at what seems like the tail end of a phrase, but it's already sweeping up into this next idea. And although it's not very Rachmaninoff melody, Rachmaninoff reportedly told Moseyevich that it was his favorite prelude. Before I even knew that, I honestly thought this was my favorite as well. I don't know, it just has such a unique feel to it that stands out from a lot of the rest of his work in my mind. To me, one of the fascinating parts about this chordal section is that it has very few majors or minors. It's a lot of suspensions and a lot of ninths. So it's based around this idea of ascending suspensions. There's your first major. This major very quickly becomes a suspension or a 2 chord. And this G9 finally has another major as well, but it's always moving upward into another suspension. So what was an F sharp suspended becomes a B2 into another suspension. Finally, it culminates in actually a major chord. However, this major, it has a Lydian feel to it. So when you actually analyze the chords, you realize there are more majors than minors, although the 9th gives it an ambiguous feel. I don't know, the connection that I made to this might be a little strange, but in a lot of rock music, the power chords are based around the fundamental, the 5th, and the 9th. So therefore the chords have a kind of heaviness to them. They call them power chords. This to me sounds like ascending power chords. Coming straight out of this into the L'Estesso tempo, you have kind of another rhythmic pattern. It's based on the beginning, but with more of these double-dotted rhythms. And this I also was struggling with on how to phrase them. I just ended up using the same idea of decrescendoing off of all of the initial attacks, and that also seemed to work here as well. Decrescendo. Here he writes crescendo. And back down. Now, I love this little run here. I can't say that I know of any other Rachmaninoff piece that uses this type of scale. And it's just like one note away from being the Japanese sen scale. If he added that G in there, I'm not exactly sure what to call it this when it's in this format. But the way he wrote it is reminiscent of all those ninths, suspensions, and two chords. So you've got your B suspended or your B2. You have your fourths there. Actually, it is the sen scale with that G at the very bottom. I don't think that was necessarily what he was intending, but it kind of works out that way. At the end of that phrase, when everything flies upwards, I could almost picture like cinematography, like this bird ascending up from this ship and just kind of flying away. The ending is a very brief recap of the beginning. At the final phrase, though, he does something interesting. It's like an inverted Picardy third. So in Baroque or classical music, when a piece was written in a minor key, it would often end on the major, just so that it wasn't ending on such a somber note. Here, Rachmaninoff does the exact opposite. Here's minor. Then he switches to major. Again, B major. I choose to do something that other people, I haven't heard this, but I did want to keep that line, which is why I chose to accent that D rather than the F sharp. I just wanted to keep that going. I think it works. So again, if this was cinematography, this would be a total fade to black moment.